Night arrived like a breath across the plain, cooling sweat and quieting song. Farmers set down their tools as stars pricked the black, and a figure moved along the horizon where light would not follow. Her cloak was the color of exhausted ink, and her hair spilled like river shadows. Children later whispered that she spoke before dawn, that the world listened, and a single silence answered. This was Nyx, the first knight born before order, older than fate, a presence even the greatest gods treated with cautious awe. Tonight we trace her footprints through myth, ritual, and the fragments scholars have fought to read. The earliest references to Nyx appear at the very edge of Greek cosmogony. Hesiod's Theogony, composed in the 8th century before the Common Era and preserved in medieval manuscripts, lists her as one of the primordial beings who emerged at the dawn of existence. The Theogonian account of the origins and genealogy of the gods places Nyx alongside Chaos and Erebus, naming her the mother of a terrifying brood. Her presence in the Theogony suggests an archaic status that predates the Olympian order. Archaeological evidence from archaic contexts complicates the picture. Black figure pottery from the 6th century before the Common Era sometimes depicts a robed female figure associated with nocturnal scenes, and votive inscriptions briefly invoke a name scholars read as Nyx in sanctuaries outside Athens. The material evidence predates the literary tradition by centuries in some regions, hinting that her cult or her conceptual presence circulated before surviving texts codified her role. Linguistic analysis reveals a name that resists neat Indo-European derivation, and many philologists propose connections to pre-Hellenic substrata. The etymology traces to unexpected origins outside Greece, which strengthens arguments for local cultic formations absorbed into Greek myth. Textual variants suggest multiple redactions across centuries. Some later poets recast her as a more remote, almost abstract figure, while Orphic fragments emphasize her generative power. No academic consensus exists on this crucial passage, especially regarding how much of the Nyx we meet in Hesiod reflects older ritual practice. Comparative evidence points to an origin scholars still debate. In Anatolia and the Eastern Mediterranean, night goddess motifs share features with Nyx, but establishing direct lines of transmission remains contested. The sequence of adoption, syncretism, the blending of different religious traditions, and reinterpretation unfolded over centuries. This multiplicity explains why Nyx can feel at once primordial and curiously modern in resonance. Consider a fragmentary inscription recovered during excavations at a cemetery outside Corinth in the 19th century. A shallow bowl bore a scratched invocation to the Dark Mother, and soil analysis suggested votive depositions dated to the 7th century before the Common Era. Such finds register ritual practice seldom recorded by elite poets. That boundary between text and altar is where Nyx lives in the archaeological record. At the liminal edge of Hesiod's opening scene, Nyx steps out of the void and becomes a character whose gestures shape the world. Liminal existing at thresholds and boundaries best describes her mode of presence. Theogony's poet names her, and then lists children whose functions stitch the cosmos together: hypnos, sleep; thanatos, death; the moirai, the fates. Their births read like a ritual taxonomy. In a narrative that survives in fragmentary form, we can imagine the scene: a cradle of darkness, the first breath like wind across a black field. Nyx sits, her hand shading a newborn who will later press the eyelids of the living into the final rest. This image appears in vase painting as a robed nocturnal mother hovering near reclining figures. The text specifies a detail modern readers often overlook. Nyx acts not merely as a background emblem, but as a causative force who yields powers to other divinities. In an extended episode preserved in later Hellenistic summaries, a mortal king bargains with Nyx for the release of his dead son. The setup places the supplicant in a moonless grove, fumbling with leaves and clay, offering a libation of honey and barley. Nyx arrives as a silence that presses the throat. Her voice is said to be low as the earth, and even the nearby owls fall still. The action that follows is exacting. She demands a measure of the king's future joy and names a price measured in years rather than gold. He protests, clutching plaster offered to gods and ancestors, but the terms stand like law. Nyx lifts her hand, and a shadow passes from the shape of the sun into the grove's roots. She returns the boy, but he moves through the world as one who has known the dark. The resolution is bitter and strange. The king gains his son, but loses the unshadowed life he once envisioned. The consequence colors the city that raised him, ceding rights that mark the living with minor mortifications on nights of mourning. Scholars debate where this episode originates. Papyri recovered from Oxyrhynchus in the 2nd century of the Common Era preserve non-canonical variants of nocturnal descent myths that echo this motif. The text specifies a detail modern readers often overlook in those papyri, a ritual wording that aligns the exchange with funerary practice. Papyri recovered from Oxyrhynchus preserve crucial variant readings, and those variants suggest an oral backbone older than the written record. The episode demonstrates how myth encodes ritual obligations in narrative form. These obligations then shape cult practice outside official temple calendars. The pattern appears in later magical papyri and in inscriptions that set specific days for offerings to night deities. The practice would influence how households framed death and sleep as linked phenomena. Nyx rarely stands alone in classical narratives. She pairs with Erebus and the darkness of primordial space. Erebus, named as the personification of deep darkness, is often styled as her consort in genealogies that predate Olympian myth. Together, they generate a gallery of deities whose domains cover transition and finality. What happened next would define her role for millennia, because these offspring structure how Greeks imagined thresholds between living and dead. Another full narrative episode survives in late mythographic summaries and focuses on a dispute between Nyx's children. The setup places Hypnos, sleep, beside Thanatos, death, in a field of poppies. A traveler collapses between them, and both deities argue over his soul. Sound carries badly through the scene, winds move like quiet hands, and the poppy heads nod as if listening. Hypnos attempts to soothe the traveler into benign oblivion, while Thanatos urges the irrevocable pull. The action becomes physical. Hypnos wraps a soft veil, moving with the tenderness of someone practiced at mercy. Thanatos stands firm, his hand colder than anything made by living breath. They pull and release until dawn creeps at the horizon. The consequences are not trivial. When the traveler awakens and continues his life, he bears traces of both craftsmen, a propensity to dream that reveals truth, and a sober knowledge of mortality that makes certain choices irrevocable. The resolution shows how myth explains ritual gradations between sleep and death. The narrative served theological purposes modern readers often miss. It encoded ritual distinctions visible in funerary inscriptions and in medical papyri that prescribe sleep rituals to recover from near-death experiences. Ancient audiences would have recognized the ritual significance immediately. Scholarly analysis connects these stories to medical anthropology and to funerary cult practices described in inscriptions from Attica and Boeotia. One inscription, catalogued in the late 19th century and dated to the 5th century before the Common Era, prescribes nightly libations to the children of night at household altars. The inscription's survival in a municipal archive suggests civic acceptance of domestic nocturnal rites. Manuscript traditions preserve multiple versions of the tale. Some scholia appended to Homeric texts comment on nocturnal parentage and attribute different moral weight to Nyx's acts. Scholars have identified redactional layers in mythographic compilations, meaning multiple editors reshaped the narratives across centuries. The story's persistence indicates that Nyx's role was not static. She adapted to local rituals, philosophical reinterpretation during the classical period, and allegorical uses in Hellenistic poetry. That thematic flexibility explains why later authors could both fear and revere her. Physical traces of Nyx are subtler than traces for more popular Olympians, yet they speak to an active, if often private, religious life. Archaeological sites reveal practices literary sources never mention. Household altars frequently include apotropeia caving the power to ward off evil objects associated with night protection. Small terracotta figurines, lamps, and bowls appear in domestic assemblages dated from the 7th through the 4th centuries before the Common Era. Votive offerings show continuity across centuries of political upheaval, indicating that concern with night, sleep, and death persisted through changing civic regimes. Iconography evolves dramatically between the Archaic and Hellenistic periods. Early representations emphasize a maternal, cloaked figure who presides over sleep and funeral rites, while Hellenistic depictions sometimes render Nyx as an abstract veil or a star-scattered mantle. The same pattern appears at sites separated by hundreds of miles, from sanctuaries in Thessaly to burial contexts in Macedonia. Municipal coinage rarely bears her image, which suggests she lacked broad civic sponsorship, yet certain localities minted tokens that likely signaled protective associations for nocturnal travelers. Curse tablets and magical lead sheets preserve formulaic invocations that call upon night-associated powers for secrecy and concealment. Curse tablets preserve formulaic language still partially legible today, and some incorporate variant names that link local daimons to Nyx's household. Each symbol carried precise meaning recognizable to initiates. For example, the iconography of half-closed eyes in votive art suggests an appeal to Hypnos rather than to Nyx directly, yet such objects were often placed with dedications reading "to the Dark Mother and her children." Excavations in the early 20th century at a rural sanctuary in Boeotia yielded a cache of small lamps and poppy seed offerings beneath a threshold. Stratigraphic analysis dates the deposit to the 4th century before the Common Era, and the deposit's consistent placement beneath thresholds indicates a ritual practice linked to domestic protection. The archaeological record thus complicates the literary picture. Material culture contradicts the timeline established by texts in at least one respect. Votive forms associated with night appear in some regions earlier than their explicit naming in surviving poetry. This mismatch suggests that household religion and elite literature evolved on partly independent tracks, meeting and reshaping each other over centuries. A merchant's account from the Roman imperial period, preserved in a papyrus archive, lists payments for night offerings made at a crossroads shrine during travel. That account demonstrates how practice continued beyond the classical era into everyday transactions. Such details reveal social dimensions of worship that poets often ignore. Beyond temples and household altars, Nyx survives in more secretive traditions carried by magical practitioners and initiatory groups. Mystical practices preserved what orthodox sources condemned, and these practices often revolve around nocturnal power as a resource for invisibility, prophecy, and safe passage. Magical papyri from the 2nd century of the Common Era contain invocations that call upon Goddess of Night in a structure nearly identical to archaic hymn forms. Magical papyri contain invocations structured identically to ancient hymns, and their survival demonstrates a long thread of ritual continuity. Initiatory texts reveal teachings entirely absent from public liturgy, including structured meditations that sought visionary encounters with Nyx under controlled conditions. The practice traveled along trade routes historians can now trace. Merchant and military networks moving across the eastern Mediterranean carried ritual formulas and talismans that bear stylistic features tied to Eastern mystery cults. Translation between cultures created unexpected theological innovations, and the name Nyx appears in contexts that continue to surprise scholars. For instance, a syncretic text from the late antique Egyptian milieu pairs night deities with Egyptian darkness gods, producing a hybrid set of ritual instructions for nocturnal dream incubation. The tradition fragmented during late antiquity as Christianization altered the public face of ritual life, but folk practices preserved ritual details learned authors omitted. Folk practices preserved ritual details learned authors omitted, often in prosaic household rituals that combined apotropaic tokens with seasonal offerings. Some medieval grimoires repurpose her epithets for protective charms, showing continuity in unexpected places. One substantial question remains unresolved, and it cuts to how scholars reconstruct hidden religion. Was the association of night deities with secret magic a later accretion, or does it reflect a strand of practice that always walked the margins? For continued investigations into how esoteric traditions preserve themselves across centuries, consider subscribing. The persistence of these practices through suppression, adaptation, and reinterpretation reveals patterns of cultural memory that historians are still mapping. Nyx's afterlife stretches far beyond archaic hymns. The influence extends into domains historians rarely examine, from late antique allegory to modern poetry and fantasy. Medieval commentators transformed her meaning almost beyond recognition, rendering night as moral metaphor rather than as a discrete deity. Renaissance rediscovery then reclaimed mythic names as poetic devices, and from that recovery, modern authors borrowed images of velvet darkness and motherly night. Recent scholarship has systematically overturned earlier consensus about her marginality. Modern philologists and archaeologists have shown that night cults could be central to household religion, and that civic attitudes toward nocturnal rites vary regionally. The archetype recurs in literature across continents and centuries, showing how human imagination uses night to hold anxieties and yearnings. Contemporary movements have reclaimed Nyx for feminist and spiritual purposes, drawing on fragments of myth and on artifacts that once lay in museum cellars. The influence extends into visual arts as well. Painters in the 19th century used Nyx as a symbol of creative darkness, often reversing earlier moralizing tones. Recent archaeological discoveries require complete timeline revision in some cases, such as a cemetery deposit found in the late 20th century that included votive sets clearly dedicated to night powers and dated earlier than previously accepted examples. Cultural memory preserved what institutions tried to erase, and that preservation appears in surprising places: dream diaries, aphoristic sayings, and regional folk healing rituals. The pattern continues in forms scholars actively document now. For the modern reader, Nyx offers a model of power that is both terrifying and necessary. She is the force that frames our endings and our private recoveries. That paradox, the safety of surrender in the darkness, explains why artists and scholars keep returning to her figure. In every era, she invites reinterpretation, because night itself changes with human need. Nyx teaches a lesson about beginnings that never end. She begins the world in Hesiod's song and continues as a practical power in household rites, secret invocations, and the imaginations of poets. Her offspring give us sleep, death, and fate, which makes her not an accessory to creation, but a loom that weaves endings into the world. Modern rediscovery and archaeological work show that night worship mattered for ordinary people as much as for poets. The darkness she embodies remains essential for human reckoning with loss and rest. Consider Nyx, the constant we return to whenever we need to name what cannot be held in light.